Check that you have all of your patterns, your front, upper, front, bottom, back, upper, back, bottom, facing, and placket, your sleeve, and your necktie, as well as your skirt with the markings of the pleats all drawn on. You will also need 2 meters of trimming. First, sew up the darts on the front bottom top panel. On the back bottom panel, base the trimming along the top with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Next, we're going to sew the upper panels together. With right sides together, we're going to place the first panel on top. Flip it over and place the panel right side to wrong side. Sew all 3 panels with a 1 cm seam allowance. Flip up the back upper panels and iron well, and then top stitch on the upper panels with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. For the front bottom panels, we're going to base the trimming with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Next, we're going to attach the upper panels to the bottom panel. Make sure the center front are aligned. With right sides together, we're going to put the first panel down. Flip behind and place the other panel right side to wrong side. So you're going to sew 3 layers together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Remember to curve the fabric as you sew. Push the upper panels up and iron well, and then top stitch along the upper panel with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. With the placket right sides together along the center front, sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the facing to the front panel, align it up to the placket, and sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Push all the seam allowances towards the facing and iron well. Flip to the right side, and on the facing panel, top stitch along the seam with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Fold the facing in and iron well. Sew the front and back panels right side together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Only sew on one side of the back upper panel. Gently roll up the fabric until the other back upper panel meets one another. Match up the shoulders and sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. Pull on the fabric gently to turn it inside out. Iron the shoulder seam well. On the wearer's right, follow the placement on the paper pattern and sew on the buttonholes. With the right placket over the left placket, baste the waist down. Baste on the trimming with a 0.5 cm seam allowance at the armhole. And then sew the sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam and then push it up and iron well. Flip to the right side of the fabric and top stitch with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Moving on to the skirt panel, following the markings that you made using the paper pattern, you're going to push the pleats towards one side. All the pleats go towards one side and iron well. With the pleats folded and placed, baste 0.5 cm at the waist. Attach the top to the skirt with a 1 cm seam allowance, and then overlock. With the right sides together, sew the front and back panels together. We'll start with the wearer's right with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. On the wearer's left, we're going to start installing the zip from the notch onwards, all the way down with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Finish up the top and bottom of the zip. For the sleeve hem, fold up 3 cm, iron well, and then sew with a 2 cm seam allowance. For the skirt hem, after trying on the skirt and you are satisfied with the length, fold up the bottom of the skirt hem with 1.5 iron well, and then sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. For the necktie panel, first locate the notch. From the end of the fabric to the notch, we're going to double fold the fabric and top stitch it down. So we're going to fold 0.5 cm once, and then twice, and iron it well, and then top stitch. So that will be 3 sides on each side. Sew the necktie to the neckline. Flip open the facing, and then start from the notch on the necktie that we mentioned earlier to match the notch on the neckline. This will be the starting point. You're going to sew from one end to the other with a 1 cm seam allowance. Push away the necktie panel and then flip open the facing. Sew the top of the facing to the neckline with a 1 cm seam allowance. Check that everything has been sewn correctly by flipping it inside out. Turn it back And then we're going to grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances to reduce the bulk and tension. Push the seam allowances upwards and iron well. Fold down the necktie panel. At the edge, flip in by 1 centimeter. Place this folded edge just below the stitch line. Iron well. Turning to the right side of the fabric, we're going to sew in the ditch where the necktie meets the back, from one end to the other. Then all that's left to do is to hand sew your buttons down. And there you have it, your dress is completed.